Well, the 66th session of the UN General Assembly may have officially kicked off today, but all eyes are focused on next week, when the prospect of a real diplomatic crisis over the Palestinian bid for statehood is expected to steal the show. So we thought it would be good to talk about what we can expect next week. What and who will dominate the headlines? Of course, RT will be on the ground with exclusive coverage of the news that's shaking up the world, as well as those stories that will remain underneath the mainstream media radar. But for a quick preview, I'm joined by RT senior producer Lucy Kafanov here in studio. Lucy, I want to talk a lot about some of the different aspects of this. We cover this every year, but this year it looks like some actual news could come out of it. All eyes around the world, I think it's safe to say, will be on this Palestinian bid for statehood. And there are so many layers to this. Why don't you break this down for us?
It is kind of complicated, but very exciting to actually have some real diplomatic stuff to cover, different from the usual sort of preachy, boring speeches that we seem to get out of the Assembly. Essentially, with the U.S. Middle East peace process, the Israeli-Palestinian Middle East peace process seemingly at a standstill, which we've seen to the detriment, I guess, of the Obama administration, the Palestinians have decided to use what little leverage that they have in their eyes to appeal to the United Nations in their bid for an independent state. Now, the United Nations cannot obviously grant the Palestinians the territories that they want in the West Bank and in Gaza, with East Jerusalem as their capital, but what the UN can do is essentially recognize a new country as a full-fledged member state. Now, the way this process works is the Palestinians would have to go to the UN Security Council in order to get that kind of recognition. Who's on the Security Council? Of course, it is the United States, and the Obama administration has been very, very clear in saying that they're going to veto that effort. But the Palestinian effort doesn't end there. What they can then do is go to the General Assembly, where all you need is a simple majority to pass, which they are expected to get. And what they'll be able to gain from that is sort of switch from the non-member observing entity, which is what they are officially called right now, to a non-member observing state, kind of like what the Vatican is, for example. And what does that get them? Well, it's a little bit more than just symbolism. It would allow them to sign on to certain international bodies, like, for example, the International Criminal Court, which for obvious reasons is not something that the Israelis want to see happen.
Right, and regarding the U.S., I mean, I think it's interesting that you say the U.S. is doing a lot to make sure that this doesn't happen. But this is a little bit different from what we saw President Obama say just last year. Take a listen to this.
When we come back here next year, we can have an agreement that will lead to a new member of the United Nations, an independent, sovereign state of Palestine living in peace with Israel.
So things have changed.
Well, they've changed, but of course the Obama administration has been very, very strong on trying to back away from the president's comments. It's funny that you played that specific soundbite, because that's actually what the Palestinians are using in a new ad they just released to try to boost more international support for their bid. The White House position has, unfortunately for the Palestinians from their perspective, has always remained the same. They want negotiations between the Palestinians and between Israel. They claim that this unilateral approach by Palestine to seek recognition through the United Nations will upend the entire process and will completely stall negotiations. And that is because that would really, really isolate the U.S. They cannot turn against our ally Israel, and as we've seen, even the Saudi Arabian officials are now saying that Americans are really isolating themselves by taking this position.
One of the other things, of course, we've got to bring up is what we've seen this year, which is the Arab Spring and how much it has shaken up sort of the order of the world. We have, of course, seen the fall of some leaders and the rise of new ones. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think one of the biggest powers to watch next week is to see what will happen with Turkey. We've seen the Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan really flexing his country's muscle in the region. Right now, he's on a so-called Arab Spring state tour. He spoke before the Arab League today, where he, in the strongest, the really, really strong terms, condemned world stance towards the Palestinian issue, really supporting the Palestinian bid for statehood. And that is really, again, a really worrisome development for the U.S. and Israel. Turkey, of course, is a NATO member. They really are ramping up their power and I guess, effect in that region. They've expelled the Israeli ambassador to that country. They've threatened to send warships, armed warships, to protect any more aid convoys to the Gaza Strip. So it really remains to see whether this kind of I guess, bellicose attitude will translate to the debate next week.
And just real briefly, Lucy, we can't not talk about Iran every year. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad seems to make a big splash. Do we expect to see the same thing again?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because now we actually have some other stuff to cover other than the usual neocons coming out and flipping out about, you know, potential threat that Ahmadinejad poses to the country. We do see the usual sort of billboards, all eyes on the Iranian president's arrival. But of course, this year, some actual diplomatic issues that really do need to be resolved.
All right, RT senior producer Lucy Kafanov, thanks for doing that and for attending the conference next week. I'm sure you'll find a lot of stuff.